For 6 endless months, the Anderson mansion in Newport Beach had not known a single peaceful night. Since the death of Isabella Anderson during childbirth, the cries of 6 fragile newborns had turned marble halls into chambers of sorrow. Doctors came and went, nurses rotated until exhaustion hollowed their faces, and even the most advanced equipment could not bring silence. They cried until the walls shook, until sleep itself became a forgotten luxury. And then came one night when the impossible happened. Captured on a security camera, a young maid with a small rainbow pin over his heart carried each infant into his arms and began to sing. The wails faltered. One by one, none. The tiny bodies surrendered. For the first time since Isabella's funeral, the house slept. What no one realized was that dawn would bring not gratitude, but the start of a struggle between truth and envy, and that a letter sealed long ago by a dying mother would change everything. Liam Anderson, the man whose voice once moved boardrooms across 3 continents, had never felt so powerless. He had conquered mergers, manipulated markets, and built an empire. Yet he could not calm his own children. Standing at the doorway that night, his eyes burned from sleepless weeks. He watched as Caleb Monroe, a newly hired maid, hardly older than a college graduate, cradled little Jack, who had a mild fever that evening. Caleb's arms trembled, not from fear but from instinct. He sang a lullaby in Spanish, a tune he had learned in the orphanage where he grew up, and Jack's eyelids closed as if soothed by something deeper than medicine. Soon, Olivia, Ava, Noah, Isabella, and Mason followed, their tiny breaths weaving into one steady rhythm. The stillness felt holy. Liam stood frozen, torn between awe and suspicion, as if he had witnessed a miracle that threatened his control. Caleb never sought attention. With his slim, wiry frame, chestnut hair falling slightly over his brow, and the faint gleam of the rainbow pin stitched above his shirt pocket, he looked almost fragile himself. Yet there was strength in the way he carried those infants. Strength born not of privilege, but of surviving loneliness in a world that rarely gave second chances. He did not glance at the cameras. He did not know that Liam was watching. He only knew that 6 children who had been restless since their mother's death now breathed evenly in his arms. Eleanor Davies, the veteran housekeeper, had long prided herself on discipline. She had served the Anderson estate since Liam was a boy, and in the emptiness left by Isabella, she saw herself as the rightful guardian of order. Yet even she could not deny her failure. Her strict schedules, her endless commands to the rotating staff, had all collapsed before the cries of those infants. To watch Caleb succeed where she had failed cut into her pride more deeply than she admitted. When morning arrived, gratitude never found its place. In the daily staff meeting, Liam's exhaustion spoke before his gratitude could surface. Surrounded by employees, his voice carried the cold edge of authority as he reminded Caleb about keeping boundaries and respecting chain of command. The words stung more than they should have, because Caleb had not only soothed the babies, he had restored breath to a household on the brink of despair. Yet now, under the gaze of Eleanor and the others, he was made small. Liam believed he was protecting order, but his reprimand planted the first seed of conflict. For Eleanor, it was confirmation that the boy did not belong. For Caleb, it was proof that kindness often goes unseen. The night that began with a miracle ended with suspicion. The mansion had felt its first silence in months, but silence alone could not heal the currents of envy and fear rising within its walls. Outside, the Pacific shimmered indifferently, while within, a quiet battle for truth had only just begun. Sometimes the smallest acts of care break through where rules and wealth fail. Caleb had no authority, no legacy, no family name. He had only instinct, and it was enough to reach the children when no one else could. But in houses built on pride, even healing can be mistaken for threat. If you believe stories like this reveal hidden strength in unlikely places, stay with Heart Stories. Subscribe, share your city in the comments, and let this journey remind you that even in the darkest nights, a single song can change everything. The second night fell over the Anderson estate with the same heaviness that had marked every evening since Isabella's passing. The cries began again, a chorus that no nurse or orderly could tame. Liam Anderson stood in the corridor, shoulders slumped, his green eyes hollow with fatigue. He was ready for another sleepless night until Caleb Monroe quietly stepped forward, asking permission with the gentleness of someone who knew what exhaustion felt like. Liam hesitated, but a silent nod allowed Caleb into the nursery. Jack's forehead was still warm, a reminder of the fever from the night before. Caleb's hands, calloused from years of work, held the child with an assurance that no textbook could teach. He sang softly, weaving the same Spanish lullaby that had once comforted him as a lonely orphan. The effect was immediate. Jack's breathing slowed, the redness faded from his cheeks, and the cries that had rattled the house ebbed into silence. The others, restless in their cribs, seemed to follow their brother's lead, surrendering to sleep one after another, as though drawn into a tide of calm they could not resist. Miller, summoned for yet another late visit, stood in the doorway this time. He had seen countless interventions, endless prescriptions. Yet here before him was something unexplainable. He watched the infant's tiny fists unclench, their bodies settling in rhythm with the maid's song. Later, his words were measured, but clear what these children needed was not another adjustment of formula or dose, but a bond that reassured their hearts as much as their bodies. Connection, he remarked, is medicine in its own right. His voice carried the weight of decades in pediatrics, and Liam listened, struck by the undeniable truth of what he had witnessed. For the first time, Liam allowed his confidence in Caleb to show. The man who once scolded him publicly now rebalanced his judgment, expanding Caleb's duties, raising his pay, and granting him authority over the nightly care of the six. For Caleb, it was not reward but responsibility, proof that his presence mattered. For Eleanor Davies, however, it was something far more dangerous. Eleanor had built her life on control, the rhythms of the estate, the way linens were folded, the order of meals, even the way silence was kept in the halls, everything bore her signature. Now she watched a young outsider, a gay man who wore a rainbow pin on his chest, step into a role she had long claimed in her imagination, the one closest to Liam, the one who could restore order where she could not. Each lullaby that worked, each breath of peace in the nursery, chipped away at the identity she had built over decades. Her whispers began as suggestions. To another maid, she muttered about men who hide behind charm. To the gardener, she sighed that not everyone shows their true colors. By the time she cornered Liam in his office, her doubts had hardened into accusations. He is playing on your grief, she hinted, using your weakness as a way in. Her words dripped with care disguised as concern, but underneath was fear. The turning point came with a single ornament. The sapphire brooch that had once belonged to Isabella lay shattered on the floor of Liam's room, its clasp bent, its stones scattered like tiny tears across the rug. Caleb, caught holding a cloth as he wiped the dust from the shelves, froze when Eleanor's voice rang out. "What have you done?" she demanded, her tone sharp enough to summon footsteps from the hall. Liam entered moments later, his gaze sweeping from the broken jewel to Caleb's startled expression. The silence that followed was heavier than any cry. Caleb's instinct had saved the children again, but now he stood accused of destroying what was left of their mother's memory. Eleanor's eyes glimmered with triumph, certain that the moment had arrived to expose the young man as untrustworthy. Liam's jaw tightened, his mind torn between gratitude for the peace of the nursery and suspicion planted by a loyal servant of many years. As the pieces of sapphire were gathered into a handkerchief, one truth settled over the room. Healing children was one thing. Protecting trust was another. Caleb's gift had bought him nights of grace, but Eleanor's envy had found its weapon. Sometimes the deepest wounds in a house are not those of the children, but of the adults who cannot bear to lose control. And when jealousy distorts perception, even kindness can look like threat. It is a reminder that in families, whether bound by blood or service, envy can undo the very healing that love has begun. The sapphire brooch lay repaired by a jeweler the next morning, but the tension it had shattered remained. Liam Anderson had not raised his voice the night before. Instead, he looked steadily at Caleb Monroe and made a choice. The young maid's explanation was simple. He had been dusting, and the fragile clasp gave way. Liam believed him, not because of sentiment, but because logic pointed elsewhere. Responsibility for heirlooms had always rested with Eleanor Davies, who had overseen Isabella's possessions for decades. If safeguards had failed, it was not the doing of a newcomer. With one decision, Liam shifted the burden back onto his longtime housekeeper. Eleanor accepted his ruling with a bow of her head, but inside, humiliation hardened into fury. From that day, Eleanor turned from objects to shadows. She combed through old records, digging for stains in Caleb's past. The orphanage where he had grown up, the private households where he had once worked, the whispers of dismissal, she gathered them all, reshaping half-truths into a weapon, a history of moral confusion. She called it when she whispered to staff. Dismissed for misconduct, she claimed. Though the reality was far from scandal, the stories she pieced together painted Caleb as unreliable, dangerous to trust, a man who hid his failures behind lullabies. But when Liam pressed for clarity, Caleb told his own truth. He spoke without drama, describing nights when wealthy men had tried to blur the boundaries of service, when he had resisted and been punished with rumors rather than justice. He recalled one incident at the orphanage, where a benefactor's inappropriate advances had left him branded as trouble for speaking out. He carried those scars quietly, never seeking pity, only survival. Now, in the Anderson mansion, those same wounds were being twisted into proof of corruption. Liam listened. The man who had once barked at staff now sat in silence as Caleb unfolded years of injustice. His instinct told him that shame had no place in Caleb's voice. Instead, there was resilience, an honesty not shaped to win sympathy, but to reclaim dignity. Dark. Miller, who had witnessed the children's response firsthand, supported him, reminding Liam that actions with the infants spoke louder than any gossip. In that room, the narrative began to shift. Caleb was no longer merely a servant. He was becoming a figure whose very presence defined whether the Anderson children could rest. Eleanor did not relent. She confronted Liam with papers in hand, copies of old notes from institutions, fragments of dismissal, letters stripped of context. She laid them on his desk like evidence in a trial. Yet instead of rising to anger, Liam summoned the family lawyer, Raj Patel, to review the claims. Patel, methodical and calm, studied the pages and asked for one thing: Eleanor had not intended to reveal the full estate archive. Among the ledgers and contracts was a sealed envelope, marked with Isabella Anderson's hand, dated the final days before her delivery. It had been stored in the family safe but never presented. Patel's brows furrowed. According to records, Eleanor had been instructed months earlier to submit all documents to legal counsel. Why this letter remained hidden was a question heavy with consequence. When Patel mentioned the sealed envelope aloud, the room grew still. Liam looked at Eleanor, who pressed her lips tightly, her silence betraying more than words. Caleb remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the carpet, uncertain of what storm was about to break. The cliff's edge had arrived. The accusations Eleanor had crafted to destroy Caleb's credibility had instead unearthed a document that could reshape the entire guardianship of the children. The brooch had been a false victory. The sealed letter could be her undoing. Jealousy had pushed her to twist truth into lies. But in reaching too far, she had exposed what she most feared. For in every attempt to bury another's story, the weight of one's own secrets eventually surfaces. It is a reminder that character is tested not when we succeed, but when we face the temptation to distort another's past for our own gain. The sealed envelope sat upon the mahogany table in Liam Anderson's study, its paper yellowed but unbroken. Raj Patel, the family lawyer, adjusted his glasses as he prepared to open it. The staff gathered in uneasy silence. Though it was not curiosity that filled the air, but dread. Eleanor Davies, who had once been the unshakable pillar of the household, stood rigid at the corner. Her hands were clasped too tightly, her gaze fixed not on the envelope, but on the polished floor, as though the grain of the wood might swallow her guilt. The knife sliced cleanly through the wax, From within came a letter in Isabella Anderson's unmistakable hand, written in the final days of her pregnancy, when she must have sensed the fragility of her life. Patel's voice did not rush. He read each line with solemn clarity. If I do not survive, I ask the court to consider appointing Caleb Monroe as temporary co-guardian alongside Liam, provided he demonstrates a natural bond with our children. I met Caleb in the NICU during my volunteer visits. He has a voice that stirs calm, and the infants respond with rare peace. Her words were steady, almost prophetic. Gasps spread through the room. The staff who had whispered doubts now exchanged glances, astonished. Liam leaned forward, his breath caught between grief and revelation. Caleb's face drained of color, his chest tightening as if the walls themselves pressed against him. He had not known Isabella remembered him, let alone entrusted him with such faith. The moment connected two worlds: the lonely boy who had once sung in hospital corridors, and the billionaire family who now found themselves healed by the same lullaby. Patel unfolded an additional page, this one bearing not just handwriting, but signatures. A notarized addendum to Isabella's will, prepared under California law, documented her nomination of guardian. Witnesses had signed, a notary had sealed. It was legally valid. Patel looked directly at Liam as he confirmed, "This document carries weight before the court." The words settled like stone. Eleanor's silence, once a weapon, became a liability. She had withheld the letter for months, obstructing its presentation to counsel. Her attempt to bury the truth had crossed into misconduct, perhaps even criminal concealment. Liam's jaw tightened. His grief had long chained him, but now anger stirred beneath the surface. Not the fury of a man betrayed by servants, but the protective wrath of a father whose children's future had been endangered by deceit. He looked at Eleanor, and for the first time in years, his eyes held no trace of reliance. Caleb stood frozen, unsure whether to step forward or remain invisible. The idea that Isabella, a woman he had barely known, had chosen him in her last testament felt surreal. He remembered fleeting nights in the neonatal ward, holding fragile infants so nurses could rest, singing simply because silence felt cruel. He never sought recognition, yet Isabella had carried that memory into eternity. The cliff approached with undeniable force. Patel announced that family court would schedule a hearing to validate Isabella's nomination. The judge would weigh her request against the standard of the best interests of the child. Dr. Miller would testify about the children's health. The evidence of connection would be examined, and Eleanor's concealment would not remain hidden. The room shifted. Staff whispered. The infants upstairs slept unaware, and the mansion seemed to inhale after months of suffocation. Eleanor's face remained controlled, but her posture betrayed collapse. For decades, she had guarded the household like her own, and now the legacy she sought to preserve through dominance might end in disgrace. The truth of Isabella's letter was not only a turning point in guardianship, but a lesson in foresight. She had seen beyond wealth, beyond appearances, into the heart of one who understood care not as duty, but as instinct. Her decision revealed that love is not always written in bloodlines, but sometimes in the willingness to give without recognition. The letter in the safe was more than paper. It was proof that a mother's intuition can reach past the grave, piercing through envy, fear, and power. It reminded everyone in the room that trust is not built by control, but by compassion. And that in matters of children, the truest guardian is the one who sings even when no one is listening. The courtroom in Orange County Family Division carried a gravity unlike the mansion's silent halls. Oak benches lined this chamber, a judge presiding beneath the seal of California, and rows of observers waiting for a decision that would determine the fate of 6 infants too young to know the weight of the law. Liam Anderson sat at the petitioner's table, his shoulders squared in a suit that could not conceal the fatigue of grief. Beside him sat Caleb Monroe, dressed simply but with the rainbow pin still fixed above his heart. It glimmered under the courtroom lights, a small emblem of resilience. Dr. Miller took the stand first. His testimony was factual, not sentimental. He described the physiological changes he had observed in the children when Caleb held them: lowered fever, steadier breathing, rapid settling after nights of inconsolable crying. He explained that while medicine could not replicate such results, emotional connection often carried equal weight in pediatric health. His professional opinion was clear: Caleb's presence was not incidental, but essential. Then came the evidence from the mansion's security system. The footage displayed on a screen drew audible murmurs from those present. The 6 infants lay restless until Caleb stepped into view, his voice barely audible through the recording, yet visible in its effect. Tiny fists unclenched, bodies softened, eyes closed. The silence that followed was more powerful than any lawyer's argument. It was proof captured by the impartial lens of a camera. Raj Patel presented Isabella's sealed letter and the notarized nomination. He recited the words with steady emphasis, reminding the court that California probate code permits a parent to designate a guardian, subject to the court's evaluation of the children's best interest. He argued that Isabella had not chosen lightly, and her foresight aligned with the children's demonstrated response. The law was not sentiment, it was duty to uphold the welfare of those who could not speak for themselves. The defense of Eleanor Davies unraveled quickly. Her concealment of the letter came to light, her justifications dismissed as self-serving. The judge did not need to raise a voice. The reprimand lay in the weight of silence that followed each revelation. Misconduct had consequences, and Eleanor's decades of service could not erase the stain of withholding a mother's last directive. Yet the true twist did not come from testimony or documents, but from a small USB drive sealed with a letter. When played in the courtroom, Isabella's voice filled the chamber. She spoke calmly, as though addressing her children from beyond time. She recalled the nights at the neonatal ward, when a young volunteer, Caleb, had held her fragile newborns so she could rest. She described how he had placed coffee in her hands when exhaustion blurred her sight, how he had sung without knowing she was the mother watching from the corner. "If I cannot stay," her voice declared, "let his song remain." It is the sound they already know as safety. The room fell still. Even the judge paused before rendering the ruling. The decision recognized Liam as the sole parent with full legal rights, but appointed Caleb as co-guardian with defined authority in daily caregiving and medical consent. It was not a replacement, but an acknowledgement the children's best interest was served when both men stood together. Eleanor faced inquiry for obstruction, and Liam ended her service with only the minimal severance the law required. That night, the mansion finally breathed in harmony. Caleb held the infants in his arms, his voice weaving through the nursery like a thread of light. One by one, they surrendered to slumber, 6 small bodies resting in peace. Liam stood at his side, his whisper carrying more gratitude than command. Isabella chose well. Caleb, eyes steady, answered only, "I stayed because her letter asked me to." The hum of the lullaby and the rhythm of 6 sleeping breaths sealed the night with something no wealth could purchase: peace. In the end, the Anderson estate learned that guardianship is more than a title granted by law. It is the quiet consistency of love, the willingness to bear sleepless nights without expectation, the courage to stand firm when envy distorts truth. True care is not measured in contracts, but in the steady hands that hold a child when no one else can. Do you believe a mother's intuition can see further than law and wealth? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us your city, and subscribe to Heart Stories for more stories that heal and inspire.